For thousands of years, ancient Egypt stood as the undisputed titan of the ancient world. It remains the longest-lasting major civilization in human history. But if you try to pinpoint exactly when this massive empire fell, the timeline gets blurry. Some look to the day the last native pharaoh was driven from the throne. Others point to Cleopatra's naval defeat, or the moment centuries later when the ancient language simply went silent. Invincible empires rarely collapse in a single day. They bleed out in stages. The truth is, ancient Egypt died 3 separate times, first through the loss of its sovereignty, then the loss of its statehood, and finally the loss of its voice. This first death started from within. For centuries, pharaohs paid their administrators and officials with massive tax-exempt land grants. This slow transfer of assets funneled wealth away from the centralized government and into the hands of local temples, hollowing out the pharaoh's power. When severe droughts hit between 2200 and 2150 BC, the Nile's predictable flooding failed. Because the central government had already given away its economic surplus, it had no buffer against the famine. The kingdom shattered into rival regions as local governors began to challenge the crown. This stone relief shows an Egyptian archer and chariot in the heat of battle. It is physical evidence of a desperate military defense. A politically fractured Egypt was suddenly forced to repel a massive invasion by a mysterious seafaring confederation known as the Sea Peoples during the late Bronze Age collapse. Pharaoh Ramesses III won the war and kept the invaders out, but the financial and human cost of the conflict crippled the economy. The borders were held, but the treasury was empty. Foreign powers quickly exploited this vulnerability. Libyans, Nubians, Assyrians, and finally the Persians launched successful invasions. When Nectanebo II was driven for power, the thousands of years-old tradition of native pharaohs was gone. The physical land remained, but Egyptian sovereignty was dead. From this point forward, the civilization would be a prize ruled entirely by outsiders. The most famous of these foreign rulers arrived in 332 BCE, when Alexander the Great annexed the territory without a fight. He installed his general Ptolemy, initiating centuries of Greek control over the Nile. The Ptolemaic dynasty maintained control by adopting local culture. They presented themselves to the public as traditional pharaohs and utilized extreme royal inbreeding to keep the Greek bloodline consolidated. Eventually, the dynasty's final ruler, Cleopatra VII, faced an aggressively expanding Roman Republic. She attempted to secure Egypt's independence through calculated political and romantic alliances, first with Julius Caesar and later with Mark Antony. This marble relief shows a Roman chariot alongside soldiers, the physical arrival of Rome's military machine. Cleopatra's strategy collapsed at the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE, where the Roman general Octavian crushed her combined naval forces. With defeat certain, Cleopatra took her own life. Octavian executed her heir to end the bloodline, and annexed the territory under his direct control as a military governor. This was the death of the state. Egypt became a resource-rich province, a territory stripped of its own military and foreign policy to serve the Roman Empire. Culture often outlives the government that created it. For several centuries under Roman occupation, everyday Egyptians continued worshipping their ancient gods and practicing ancestral traditions. Eventually, the spread of Christianity across the Roman Empire pushed out the old beliefs. Without state funding to maintain the massive ancient temples, the traditional culture was slowly starved of its practitioners. By the late 4th century AD, the ancient religion had retreated to its final active stronghold, the Temple of Philae in Luxor. This is a dense array of carved symbols on the temple walls. In 394 AD, an Egyptian priest named Asmet-Akom etched this final prayer to the old gods. It is the last known hieroglyphic text in human history. A moment of wonder. When Asmet-Akom died, the specific knowledge of how to read and write the Egyptian language vanished with him. This total silence marks the third and definitive death of ancient Egypt. The history of this civilization's end is a story of a slow, centuries-long fade, first losing its native rulers, then its statehood, and finally its voice. Yet there is a profound irony in its fall. The Greeks and Romans who conquered the land became entirely obsessed with it. They exported the aesthetics, the history, and massive stone obelisks back to their own capitals. Though the language remained silent for over a millennium, the discovery of this artifact, the Rosetta Stone, provided the translation needed for the modern world to read these texts once more. A civilization's power persists in its cultural gravity, its ability to captivate the world thousands of years after the state itself has vanished.